Today, we are diving into the life and rule of one of the most controversial dictators in European history, Nicolae Ceaușescu. For over 2 decades, he led Romania through a period of intense control, fear, and propaganda. His regime became synonymous with authoritarian rule, mass surveillance, and a personality cult that placed him at the center of all decisions. In this video, we'll explore Ceaușescu's leadership, his policies, and the dramatic end to his rule. Let's start by looking at how Ceaușescu built his regime through a massive cult of personality and relentless propaganda. One of the most striking features of Ceaușescu's rule was his obsession with building a massive cult of personality. Throughout his reign, Ceaușescu was presented as a genius leader who had saved Romania and led it to greatness. His image was everywhere, from giant portraits in public spaces to statues erected in his honor. His likeness was a constant presence, shaping the daily lives of the Romanian people. The government controlled all forms of media, ensuring that the narrative about Ceaușescu's greatness was spread without question. Newspapers, television, and even educational materials were used to reinforce the idea that he was the nation's savior. It was a regime where loyalty to Ceaușescu was not just encouraged, it was mandatory. Through these efforts, the dictator was glorified as a near-mythical figure, but behind this manufactured image lay a reality filled with fear and repression. Ceaușescu wasn't just a dictator, he was a staunch nationalist with an intense focus on Romanian independence. Throughout his rule, he emphasized Romania's sovereignty and sought to distance the country from the influence of the Soviet Union, despite being part of the Eastern Bloc. In the 1960s, Ceaușescu became a vocal critic of Moscow, positioning himself as a leader who would defend Romania's interests, even if it meant defying the USSR. This nationalist ideology became the backbone of his rule, as he promoted the idea of Romanian socialism, a version of communism that was uniquely Romanian. While this strategy won him favor with certain groups, it also isolated Romania from the international community. Ceaușescu's vision for the nation was one of strict autonomy, but this often came at a great cost to its people. As we'll see, his policies would eventually lead to economic hardships and social unrest. Ceaușescu was not just a political leader, he saw himself as an economic visionary. His ambitious plans for rapid industrialization were meant to propel Romania into the ranks of more developed nations. But these policies, driven by a desire to showcase Romania's power, came with disastrous consequences. As factories were quickly built and urbanization expanded, environmental degradation and social inequality grew. The countryside, once a thriving agricultural hub, was stripped of its resources to fuel industrial growth. One of the most controversial decisions Ceaușescu made was to pay off Romania's entire national debt. While this was seen as an act of economic independence, it had severe repercussions for the population. In order to meet the demands of debt repayment, Ceaușescu ordered massive cuts to essential goods like food, electricity, and heating. People faced constant shortages and long queues for basic necessities. The government focused on exporting Romania's agricultural products and energy, leaving its citizens to suffer in silence. Ceaușescu's focus on appearances and grandeur was also reflected in his extravagant spending on major construction projects. One of the most infamous of these was the People's House, or the Palace of Parliament in Bucharest, a colossal building that drained Romania's resources and exemplified Ceaușescu's obsession with power, all while ordinary Romanians struggled with poverty. Ceaușescu's rule wasn't just marked by economic mismanagement, it was also defined by a ruthless system of political repression. To maintain control, Ceaușescu relied heavily on his secret police, the Securitate, which spied on the population and crushed any form of dissent. The Securitate had its eyes everywhere, from schools and workplaces to private homes, making sure that no one could speak out against the regime without facing severe consequences. Anyone who dared to oppose Ceaușescu's leadership was subject to surveillance, imprisonment, and even torture. Political opponents were arrested and frequently disappeared, with many never seen again. The atmosphere of fear was palpable. It was a regime where trust was non-existent, and people lived in constant fear of being denounced by their neighbors, friends, or even family members. Ceaușescu's government maintained such tight control that even ordinary citizens were forced to conform to a narrow, state-approved version of reality, the secret. Police was a tool of terror, ensuring that the people's loyalty to the regime was either coerced or compelled by fear. Ceaușescu did not rule Romania alone. His wife, Elena, played a key role in the regime and was one of the most powerful figures in the country. While Nicolae was the face of the government, Elena wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. In fact, she became one of the most important decision-makers in Romania, often holding more power than many of the country's top officials. Elena was not just the First Lady, she was actively involved in the political and economic decisions that shaped the nation. Her presence in government was undeniable, and many of Ceaușescu's policies were influenced by her. She held titles such as the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Education, but it was her close relationship with her husband that ensured her power. Together, the Ceaușescus ran Romania like a family business, consolidating control and surrounding themselves with loyalists. The country became a reflection of their dynastic ambitions, and their rule was characterized by a growing concentration of power within their own circle. One of the most extravagant symbols of Ceaușescu's power and megalomania is the Palace of Parliament in Bucharest, also known as the People's House. This massive building, one of the largest administrative structures in the world, was conceived as a monument to Ceaușescu's legacy. It's said that the construction of the palace alone cost billions of dollars, a staggering amount that could have been used to address the country's widespread poverty and economic hardships. Despite the severe shortage of food, electricity, and basic necessities for the Romanian people, Ceaușescu poured Romania's limited resources into building this colossal structure. The project involved demolishing large parts of Bucharest's historic neighborhoods, displacing thousands of people in the process. The Palace of Parliament became an enduring symbol of the regime's obsession with power and prestige, built at the direct expense of the well-being of its citizens. This extravagant project stood in stark contrast to the lives of ordinary Romanians, who were suffering from the very austerity measures that Ceaușescu had implemented to fund such ventures. The end of Nicolae Ceaușescu's rule came suddenly, and it was both swift and violent. In December 1989, mass protests broke out in the city of Timișoara, sparked by the government's treatment of a Hungarian pastor. These protests quickly spread across Romania, and soon the nation's anger was aimed directly at Ceaușescu and his oppressive regime. Ceaușescu initially tried to suppress the demonstrations by force, but as the protests grew, his authority began to crumble. On December 21st, Ceaușescu made a public speech in Bucharest, attempting to rally support, but the crowd turned against him. They began chanting "Down with Ceaușescu" and "Freedom," a stark contrast to the adoration that he had once commanded. That was the beginning of the end. Fleeing Bucharest in a helicopter with his wife, Ceaușescu tried to escape, but he was captured by the military just days later. The couple was swiftly put on trial for charges of genocide, corruption, and the abuse of power. The trial was brief, lasting just a few hours, and the verdict was clear death. On Christmas Day, 1989, Nicolae Ceaușescu and Elena Ceaușescu were executed by firing squad, marking a brutal and dramatic end to their tyrannical rule. The fall of Ceaușescu symbolized the end of an era in Romania, the collapse of totalitarianism, and the beginning of a new, uncertain future for the country. The revolution that ousted him brought an end to one of the harshest regimes in Eastern Europe, and while it marked a moment of triumph for the people, it also left behind a nation grappling with the long-term consequences of his rule. The fall of Nicolae Ceaușescu marked the end of more than 2 decades of oppressive rule in Romania. His regime, which had been built on fear, control, and a manufactured image of greatness, ultimately crumbled under the weight of public dissent and the economic collapse he caused. The revolution of December 1989 not only toppled Ceaușescu, but also signaled the death of totalitarianism in Romania, paving the way for a new era of democracy. Yet the legacy of Ceaușescu's rule still lingers. The country faced immense challenges as it tried to rebuild after years of repression and economic mismanagement. The scars of his regime, the fear, the surveillance, and the lack of basic freedoms left deep marks on Romanian society. Still, Ceaușescu's fall serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of democratic values. Let's reflect on the lessons learned from Romania's past, the need for vigilance. In protecting human rights and the fundamental freedoms that define a just society,